A dark ribbon of Missouri highway. 12 dump trucks in single file running with their radios off their headlights swallowing the frost along the shoulders of the county road. The convoy turns onto a narrow ribbon of packed dirt between rows of dormant lavender. Steel blades tilt. Loads begin to fall. Somewhere far up under the eaves of a gray farmhouse at the end of that road, one small yellow window is burning. Close on a leather-gloved hand signing an order by flashlight. Close on a placard being wired to a fresh cedar stake. Private construction zone, no entry. By first light, a wall of raw brown fill will rise between a woman and the only road her family has held for 100 years. They will believe they have buried her future along with the ground. They will not know yet what lies waiting beneath her kitchen floor. The dark had not yet lifted from the ridgeline above Bell Hollow when the first of the 12 trucks rolled off the state highway and turned onto the packed dirt of Larkspur Road, their headlights washing the frostbitten hedgerows in a pale industrial white. They came in a slow procession with their diesel engines held to a low growl, the way a man walks softly through a house he intends to rob, and the drivers had been paid enough to keep their radios off and their questions unspoken. At the head of the line, a black pickup with tinted glass moved without hurry, and the man in the passenger seat held a clipboard against his knee, and he did not once look up from the numbers he was reading. Reed Kettleman had done this kind of work in 3 states already, and he had learned that the trick to burying a road was not the volume of the fill, but the confidence with which it was placed. He stepped down onto the shoulder in his leather boots and his laminated hard hat, and he lifted the beam of a heavy flashlight along the frozen ditch to mark the width the crews would need. The lavender rows across the fence line stood in their winter ranks gray and stiff, and bowed with rime, and beyond them, the low gable of a farmhouse showed against the pre-dawn sky, one dim yellow window burning far up under the eaves like a small stubborn signal. He looked at that window for a moment longer than the job required, and then he turned back to his clipboard because he had been told the woman inside was a small problem, and he had come to make her a smaller one before breakfast. By the time the sky over Missouri began to pale, the 12 loads had been dumped in a raw brown mound that ran fence to fence across the corridor, and a placard on a fresh cedar stake had been wired into the shoulder in the same clean, indifferent lettering the corporation used from Kansas City to Charleston. Redstone Inland Port. Vandermeer Meridian Development. Private construction zone, no entry. Reed Kettleman photographed the sign for his file, climbed back into the pickup, and did not glance again at the farmhouse window as the convoy backed out onto the highway, because in his experience, the people who watched from windows tended to weep, then bargain, then sign. He had a spreadsheet that showed how long each stage usually took, and Delphine Hollister was penciled in for a Tuesday. She had been awake since 4 the way she had been awake since 4 on every delivery day for the better part of a decade, moving through the dim kitchen without turning on the overhead light because the low bulb over the sink was enough for a woman who could name each cupboard by touch. A blue enamel pot muttered on the stove. A red notebook with the season's orders sat open beside her mug. Bristol's photograph, taken on her first day of college 2 Septembers back, had been slid under the corner of the salt cellar, the way she always slid it there when the house felt too quiet, and Delphine Hollister let her eyes rest on that photograph for exactly 1 breath before she carried her coffee out to the porch to gauge the sky. Frost lay over the fields in a silver crust, and the rows of lavender ran off toward the tree line in tidy corridors that she and her mother had straightened by hand 3 summers running, and the greenhouse glass along the south wall caught the first pinkness of morning and threw it back at her in a low, honest light. She loaded the crates of heirloom seed into the bed of the old white pickup by herself, because there was no one else to load them, and because she preferred it that way, and she counted them twice, and she tied the tarp down with the same square knot her grandmother had shown her when she was 8. Then she climbed into the cab and turned the key, and the engine settled into its familiar rattle, a sound she had come to trust more than most human voices. She rolled down the gravel drive toward Larkspur Road with her mug wedged between her thigh and the seat, and she was already thinking 2 loads ahead, already sorting in her mind which of the co-op orders would go on the truck first and which would ride the shelf at the greenhouse for another day, when her boot came off the pedal without any command from her mind at all. The pickup coasted for a length of fence, then stopped, and Delphine Hollister sat behind the wheel and looked at a wall of dirt where a road had been the evening before. It ran from tree line to tree line across the corridor higher at the crown then the top rail of her fence wide enough at the base that a person could have taken 3 long strides across it and not reached the far edge. The raw fill had settled a little in the cold, and its top glittered with the same silver crust that lay on the lavender as though some enormous machine had scraped a hillside open somewhere else in the county and hauled its wound to her doorstep and left it. She did not, in that first minute, move. She set the mug carefully into the cup holder. She turned the engine off. She listened. Beyond the mound, she could hear the diesel cough of idling machines somewhere in the middle distance, and a man's laugh thin in the cold, and the whistle of a foreman calling a crew back to work. She stepped down onto the frost. She walked the length of the barricade once in each direction, looking for a gap, for a seam, for a stray corner where a person on foot might yet slip through. She found none. A survey stake with a strip of orange tape had been driven into the shoulder of what used to be her road, and the placard wired to it announced in letters clean and confident and utterly indifferent that this ground now belonged to a project she had never signed a paper for. She was still standing there when a white pickup ground to a stop on the far side, and a man in a hard hat picked his way over the loose fill toward her clipboard, tucked under his arm, the way a preacher carries a Bible on a house call. Reed Kettleman introduced himself as the site manager for Vandermeer Meridian, his voice smooth as showroom leather, and he did not bother to lower himself to the frost the way she had. He told her in tones borrowed from a customer service script that the road she had used every day of her adult life sat inside the construction footprint of the Redstone Inland Port, a logistics center valued at $900 million, and that access through this corridor was as of this morning closed. When she asked how she was supposed to move her harvest and her seed to market, he gestured vaguely southward with the clipboard, the way a man dismisses a fly, and he mentioned the old drainage track that curved around the section line. A rutted farm lane. No loaded truck should ever attempt a detour of better than 30 miles over ground that would beat a fully laden pickup half to death by the second week. He said it the way another man might mention the weather. Behind him, 2 of his crew leaned against the mound of dirt as though it were a countertop in a bar, watching her the way people watch something already finished. Delphine did not raise her voice. She had learned young that raising her voice had never once in her life moved a thing that money had already decided to move. She only asked him quietly, her breath white in the cold, who had signed the order to bury a road that did not belong to them. Reed Kettleman smiled at that, a thin, practiced smile, the smile of a man who had answered this question in 3 states before hers. And he told her she would be smart to take the corporation's buyout offer before this old place turned into nothing but a worthless patch of mud with a house on it. He let his eyes drift past her at the sagging barn and the greenhouse and the dormant lavender as though appraising a corpse. And everything in his posture said what the whole arrangement said, that she was a poor woman alone, too small to fight, too broke to sue, too sentimental to know when to fold. She did not answer him. She turned and looked at the wall of dirt where her road had been, and then back at the gray farmhouse where 4 generations of Hollister women had been born, and she let the silence stretch until Reed Kettleman grew bored and climbed back over his mound of dirt and slammed his door hard enough to make the loose earth shiver. His pickup ground its way south along the corridor and disappeared behind the tree line, and the diesel cough of the idling machines picked up its rhythm again, and she stood alone in the frost, with her breath rising in slow, deliberate columns and her hands very still at her sides. Standing there in the cold, Delphine remembered her grandmother's hands. She remembered the flour worked into the seams around the knuckles and the small brown burn on the base of the thumb from a long-ago accident with a canning kettle, and above all, she remembered the boot. Prudence Hollister had a habit in the last year of her life of tapping the pantry floorboard with the toe of her worn boot whenever a certain kind of caller came to the porch, whenever a man from the county or a fast-talking cousin arrived to explain how the family ought to be practical about the land. Prudence had not said much on those occasions. She had only tapped the floorboard once, twice, 3 times, as though beating out a rhythm only she could hear, and then she had shown the caller to the door. "Never sell the ground," the old woman used to say, tapping the board. "Never sell it until you have read what lies beneath the kitchen." Delphine had been young enough at the time to hear that, as an old woman's habit of speech, and she had let the words slide off her the way one lets any often-repeated warning slide, and she had never once in the 30 years since Prudence's funeral so much as tested that plank with the toe of her own boot. Now looking at the mound of dirt where her road had been, she began to wonder whether her grandmother had been telling her all those years precisely where to look. The town of Bell Hollow had not been this excited in a generation, and the reason was written on the banners strung across Main Street and printed across the front page of the weekly paper. The Redstone Inland Port promised jobs, real jobs, hundreds of them, along with widened roads and cold storage and a rail spur in a future that did not involve watching the young people leave one by one for Kansas City or St. Louis. Marguerite Vandermeer, the chief executive of Vandermeer Meridian Development, had been photographed beneath a rendering of gleaming warehouses with the mayor's hand pressed reverently between her own, and the caption beneath the photo had called her in the earnest small-town way the woman who had come to save a dying town. In the diner, in the feed store, in the pews on Sunday, people spoke of the project the way the faithful speak of deliverance. And against that current of hope, one stubborn farm looked less like a home and more like an obstacle. In a booth at the diner over coffee that had gone lukewarm, two men from the county board agreed that Delphine Hollister ought to sell and be done with it, that she was only holding a few rows of flowers and some old fruit trees, and a barn full of seed nobody but a handful of stubborn heirloom growers still wanted. One of them, a man who managed loans at the local bank, leaned back and offered the line that would travel around town by nightfall, that nobody beats the Vandermeers with a shovel in a henhouse. The others laughed because it was easier to laugh than to picture themselves standing on the wrong side of a mound of fill, and because a town that has decided to believe in something does not care to be reminded of the cost. Delphine heard some of it directly because Bell Hollow was small and voices carried, and the diner had thin walls between the counter and the row of booths behind it, and she heard the rest of it in the way the room shifted when she came in for her coffee and her mail. Nobody was cruel to her face. It was worse than cruelty in its way, the soft pity of people who had already written her ending, the too bright greetings and the small silences, and the eyes that slid away before she could catch them. And she paid for her coffee and nodded to the woman behind the counter and walked back out to her truck. The whole time she felt the weight of a town lined up quietly and completely on the side of the money. She had, so far as she could tell, not a single ally in all of Bell Hollow, and she drove home along the long southern detour with dust in her teeth, and she did not let herself cry, because crying was a thing you did when you were finished, and she was not finished yet. That same week, Marguerite Vandermeer stood at a podium before a bank of local cameras in the county assembly hall and declared with the smooth assurance of a woman who had closed 100 deals larger than this one that the Redstone project had resolved every outstanding matter of land and access along its footprint. She wore charcoal wool that had been cut in a city Delphine had never seen. Her platinum earrings caught the newslight in tight, controlled sparks. When a young reporter near the front asked about the Hollister farm and the road that had been closed, Marguerite let a small, patient smile cross her face, the smile of an adult indulging a slow child. A single dirt road, she offered, cannot be permitted to stand in the way of the future of an entire region. The room in its way seemed to agree. Nobody asked who had buried the road or by what right, and the cameras clicked off. And the woman who had come to save the town walked out to a black sedan that cost more than the Hollister farm had earned in 5 clean years. A week after the road was buried, a pair of attorneys in press suits drove up the long detour and parked their spotless dark sedan in Delphine's frostbitten yard, and they came bearing a contract and the unmistakable air of men who expected gratitude. They spread the papers across her kitchen table without waiting to be invited to sit, and they offered on behalf of Vandermeer Meridian the sum of $40,000 for a permanent easement across the road corridor and the strip of ground along her northern boundary. The figure was low enough to be an insult, and they knew it because they knew as well as she did that without her road the farm was a lung, with its windpipe pinched shut worth a fraction of what it had been a week before. The taller of the two did most of the talking, and he talked in a language built to frighten, dropping terms like right of condemnation and public benefit, and industrial reason zoning and post-seizure compensation, letting each one land on the checked oilcloth and settle before reaching for the next. He wanted her to understand that the machinery of the state was already in motion, that resistance was not merely futile but expensive, that the only choice left to her was how gracefully she surrendered. Delphine said nothing while he performed. She read the contract slowly, line by line, her farmer's eye catching what her silence hid, and she found among the dense paragraphs the clauses that mattered, the ones by which she would waive forever any right to challenge, to appeal, to complain, to reclaim anything at all. Then the shorter attorney tried the gentler blade, and it was the crueler of the two. He mentioned with a show of sympathy that lived only on the surface of his mouth that he understood she had a daughter away at college, and that tuition at the university in Columbia was a heavy thing, and that a sensible mother would not turn her own pride into a burden her family had to carry. He let those words sit there in her kitchen, in the very house where she had raised that daughter alone, and he watched to see them do their work. It was the deepest cut they had brought with them, aimed precisely at the two things they believed made her weak: that she was a woman alone, that she was not rich. They believed those were her wounds. They did not understand, either of them, that those were her spine. Delphine folded the contract along its crease, squared its edges against the salt cellar, and pushed the papers back across the table until they sat exactly where the men had first placed them. Her voice, when it came, was low and even, with the particular calm of a woman who had already decided something the strangers across from her had not yet noticed. "I will not sell you something you have not yet proven belongs to you." The taller attorney gave a small laugh, the kind grown men give when a child says something unexpectedly firm, and gathered his papers, certain she was only playing at strength, only holding out for a better number, the way stubborn people always did. They told her the offer would not last. They left their card on the checked oilcloth. They drove back down the long detour, trailing dust, already composing in their minds the memo that would report her as difficult but manageable, and Delphine watched their taillights until the tree line took them. That night, she did not turn on the overhead lamp. She stood at the kitchen sink with both hands flat against the porcelain, listening to the wind work through the windbreak of Osage orange her great-grandmother had planted 100 years back, and she felt the ordinary architecture of her life shift a quarter turn on its foundation. The bank had already called with a soft, apologetic voice about the seasonal operating note, mentioning regretfully new concerns about the farm's stability. A buyer up in Boone County had canceled a standing order for heirloom seed, unwilling to risk goods that might not reach him if the road stayed closed. The pressure had begun to come from every direction at once, and none of it left a mark that a court would ever recognize. And she understood, as she stood at the sink, that the corporation's true weapon was not the mound of dirt out at the fence line. Its true weapon was patience. She let herself think for the first time all week about her grandmother's boot on the pantry floorboard, about the strange emphasis Prudence Hollister had placed on that plank in the last months of her life, tapping it, holding Delphine's gaze across the kitchen, until the young woman had grown impatient and looked away. Delphine had assumed in the way of the young that the tap had been a nervous habit. She thought now, standing in the dark, that it had been the only kind of instruction Prudence had trusted the world to leave alone, an instruction hidden in a gesture no stranger would ever bother to read. She crossed to the pantry, knelt down beside the shelves of jars, and worked her fingers along the seam of the plank her grandmother had marked so many times with the toe of her worn brown boot. It gave under her hand with a small dry sigh of something that had been waiting a long time to be lifted. Beneath the board, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff with age, sat a wooden box she had not opened since Prudence's funeral. A plain thing of pine with a small brass hasp, no bigger than a bread pan. She lifted it free, brushed the dust from its lid with the flat of her palm, and carried it to the kitchen table. And she set it down beneath the low bulb over the sink, the way one sets down a thing that must not be broken. Inside were photographs curled at the corners, tint types gone brown with time, and a small bundle of letters in a slanting hand tied with brittle blue ribbon in a folded plait soft as cloth from a century of being folded and unfolded and folded again. At the very bottom of the box, protected in a sleeve of wax paper, lay a deed gone the color of weak tea. She carried it to the table and unfolded it beneath the light, and the paper crackled like something waking after a long sleep, and she began to read words set down more than a century before she was born. The deed had been drawn in the year 1912 in a shared name she had heard only once or twice in her childhood, whispered by Prudence, like a small private prayer. Marlowe Threadgill Hollister. The heavy notary script recorded the woman as the wife of one Josiah Hollister, formerly of Threadgill by her people's name, and the two of them together were named as the grantees of a parcel that Delphine recognized at once, because she had walked its fence line 1,000 times, because her mother Genevieve had walked it before her, because Prudence had walked it before either of them. Marlowe Threadgill Hollister had brought the ground into the family by her own hand in a year when women were not commonly permitted to hold ground in their own names, And the deed did not describe Larkspur Road as an ordinary public track, the kind a county could vacate or a corporation could bury. It described the road as a perpetual right-of-way granted and bound to the Hollister farm itself, running with the land through every generation that should hold it so long as the family kept the ground. In the dense looping script of the old notary, it carried one clause unlike anything Delphine had ever seen in a farm paper. And when her eye finally reached the sentence, she set the deed down and pressed her hand flat against the checked oilcloth, as though she needed the table to hold her upright. Should any neighboring holder of land ever obstruct, bury, or convert this way to commercial use without the written consent of the farm's owner, control of the northern strip of ground adjoining the way would revert wholly and immediately to the owner of the Hollister farm. She read it twice more before she trusted her eyes. Then she reached for the letters tied with the blue ribbon because a woman who wrote a clause like that had not been an ordinary farm wife, and Marlowe Threadgill Hollister had not made a habit of writing paper that did not matter. The letter on top of the bundle had been folded so many times its creases were nearly worn through, and the ink had faded in patches, but the hand was firm and the words came clear. Marlowe had written the letter to her only daughter in the winter of 1912 from a Missouri farmhouse. Delphine now sat inside, and she had written it in the aftermath of a fight against the Kansas and Southern Railroad in the year 1910, a fight the family had almost lost. The company had wanted the same corridor of ground for a spur line to a limestone quarry farther east. Their agents had come first with promises and then with threats. When Marlowe had refused their money, the men had ridden out one November morning and driven stakes across the corridor and hung placards that said the ground was theirs by right of public necessity. Marlowe had spent every dollar she had and every friend she owned, and she had won the corridor back in a courthouse in Jefferson City with a single old survey and the testimony of 2 neighbors who had died before Delphine was born. I write this to you, the letter said, so that no daughter of ours ever again stands in a frozen yard, staring at a fence some rich man has thrown across her ground, believing herself to be alone. I have set into the deed a thing they will not think to look for. Read it slowly. Read it more than once. The rich can buy land, but they are too lazy to read its history. Keep the box under the pantry board. Tap the plank each time you pass so your daughters, after you learn to look down before they look up. Delphine sat very still with that letter open in her hands, and she felt across 100 years the deliberate, unhurried courage of a woman she had never met, but whose blood she carried, and she understood at last what her grandmother had been trying to hand her across that kitchen floor in the last months of her life. Prudence had not been speaking in riddles. She had been passing along a weapon. The phone on the windowsill buzzed against the wood, and she saw her daughter's name on the screen, and she pressed the phone to her ear and looked at the brittle deed lying under the bulb. Bristol's voice came through tight and quick, 20 miles away in a dormitory in Columbia, and even the college dorm had heard by nightfall that the Hollister Farms road had been buried in the dark. Bristol had waited as long as she could stand it before calling, and she asked the question that a 19-year-old will always ask a mother from the far end of a phone line, whether it was as bad as people were saying. Delphine took a breath before she answered. She looked at the deed. She looked at the letter beside it in Marlowe's steady, unhurried hand. I have not lost, she told her daughter in the plain voice she used when she needed to be believed. I have only just found the thing they forgot to bury. She told Bristol to keep her mind on her exams and her heart out of Bell Hollow, and she meant it, and when the call ended she sat a long while in the dark kitchen with the paper glowing faintly under the low light, watching the pale rectangle of it, the way another woman might have watched a candle. Then she wrapped the deed carefully in a clean linen cloth, set it in the bottom of her canvas bag beside the letters, and the Platt laid the wooden box back in its hiding place under the pantry board and pressed the plank down with the flat of her palm as though sealing a promise. She woke before the sun and drove east instead of south, taking the long detour once again, with the deed nestled between the folds of her scarf on the passenger seat, and she left Bell Hollow behind her in the rear-view mirror without a backward glance. She had spent the last of her patience on the town the evening before, and the anger that had come to sit in its place was of a colder and more useful kind, the anger of a woman who had finally understood what she was holding in her hands. She had decided to find someone who could tell her in plain American English exactly how much a 100-year-old paper was worth when a $900 million project sat on top of it. The next town over was called Elkin Ford, And it was smaller than Bell Hollow, and its main street had the tired dignity of a place that had learned to expect less from the world without learning to resent it. Delphine parked the truck in front of an old brick pharmacy on the corner of 2nd and Chestnut, and she climbed a narrow flight of stairs beside the pharmacy door to a landing with a single pebbled glass door and a name lettered on it by hand. Winifred Ashby, attorney at law. Below the name in smaller script, a further line offered land boundaries in agricultural matters, and Delphine understood, without being told, that the woman inside had been practicing long enough to have chosen her narrowness on purpose. She knocked once, then opened the door. The office was one room and a back closet, and its owner sat behind a scarred wooden desk with a green banker's lamp lit against the gray morning. Winifred Ashby was somewhere near 60, her hair cut short and iron gray, her hands square, her eyes patient in the particular way of women who have spent 30 years being underestimated by better-dressed men. She did not look like the sort of attorney who won against a $900 million development. That Delphine would come to understand was the mistake that the corporations kept making. Delphine did not begin with the road. She began at Winifred's quiet prompting with the box under the pantry board and the letter in Marlowe's slanting hand, and only then with the deed itself, which she unfolded across the desk with the care of a woman laying out a wounded animal. Winifred put on a pair of small reading glasses and did not speak for a long time, and her finger traced the looping script one line at a time. And once near the reversion clause, her lips moved silently, as though tasting the exact weight of the language. When she finally lifted her head, her face had changed, and she asked Delphine to sit down, which Delphine had not yet done. "If this deed still holds," Winifred said, "and I believe on first reading that it does, then Vandermeer Meridian has not merely blocked the wrong road. They have trespassed against a private property right that was never extinguished. And worse, they may have filed a false statement in the permit application for the entire project. That," she added, "is a far graver matter than a suit for damages, because a $900 million project of this kind sits from the beginning on a sworn representation to the state that the site carries no unresolved dispute over access or right-of-way. If that representation is false, then the ground beneath the project is not merely contested, it is rotten." Delphine asked the only question that mattered to her, which was whether they could win. Winifred took off the small reading glasses and told her the truth in the plain way of a woman who had learned that any other kind of answer was a form of theft. "No one is ever certain of winning against a company that size," she said. "They have money enough to make a fair fight feel like a landslide. This will not be quick, and it will not be clean, and it will not be cheap." Then something hard and bright came into her voice as she leaned forward across the desk, and Delphine felt for the first time in a week that she was not alone in the room. "But this deed," Winifred said, tapping the corner of it once with her square, blunt finger, "is good enough to keep those people awake at night, and that is not nothing." She did not stop there. 20 years ago, she went on her eyes level with Delphine's over the banker's lamp. She had lost a case very much like this one, up near Poplar Bluff, where a mining outfit had buried the spring that fed a widow's dairy herd, and the widow had come to her too late and with too little, and the case had ended in a way Winifred had never once in 20 years allowed herself to forget. She did not describe what had happened to the widow. She did not need to. She only said in that same low-level voice that she had promised herself on the courthouse steps that day, that if a woman ever again walked up her stairs with an old deed and a buried road, she would not be sent away without a fight. Delphine understood then that she had not walked into a stranger's office. She had walked into the tail end of a promise a woman had made to a ghost. Winifred asked whether the family still kept the original plat, and whether an independent surveyor could be found who was willing to lay it against the corporation's current site plan without asking too many questions of anyone in Bell Hollow. Delphine answered that she knew a man in the next county who had walked the family boundaries with her mother 12 years before, a quiet old surveyor by the name of Ambrose Thorne, who had a reputation for saying little and meaning all of it. "Then bring him?" Winifred said, gathering the deed and the letter and the plat into a folder with the same care Delphine had used when she laid them out. "Because before we file a single page, I want to know exactly where the northern strip runs, and I want to know it in numbers no lawyer in Kansas City can talk out from under us." They agreed on a fee that was more than Delphine could spare and less than the office ought to have charged, and they shook hands across the desk, and Delphine went back down the narrow stairs with the folder clutched inside her jacket, the way a woman carries a newborn out of a hospital. She sat in the pickup for a full minute before she turned the key, watching a gray sparrow tick along the windowsill of the pharmacy, and she let herself feel for one careful breath the small, clean weight of having found a person who had chosen her side without being asked twice. The drive back was long. She took it slower than she needed to because she wanted the miles to give her time to think, and because the truck was easier company than the town had been. Somewhere along the county highway, the sky began to lower, and a fine, cold rain drifted in from the west and softened the shoulders of the road. And by the time she turned onto the last stretch of the detour, she had the wipers ticking a slow rhythm across the glass. She had almost begun to feel steady again when she came within sight of her own fence line and saw the yellow excavator parked 3 feet from her western wire, its bucket suspended in the air, its engine coughing to itself in the rain like some enormous animal that had been chained to the corner of the pasture on purpose. Reed Kettleman had not been idle in her absence. He had brought the machines closer. He had ordered a fresh cut into the shoulder of what used to be the road, close enough that the loose earth had spilled through the strands of her fence and dulled the last brown stems of the lavender along the ditch. He himself was leaning against the machine when she rolled to a stop, a paper cup of coffee steaming in his hand, and he tipped it toward her the way another man might tip a hat. He did not need to speak to make his meaning clear. He was standing on her ground in her rain drinking her weather, and he wanted her to see it. Delphine let the truck idle a moment. Then she nodded to him once slowly the way a person nods to a wolf across a clearing, and she rolled on toward the house without giving him another look. She parked in the yard and carried the folder inside and set it on the checked oilcloth beside the salt cellar. And she stood a while at the sink, with her hands wrapped around a fresh cup of coffee, watching the rain darken the sagging planks of the barn. She thought about Marlo Threadgill Hollister in the winter of 1912, sitting at some earlier version of this same table, writing to a daughter she must have known she would never see grown. She thought about Prudence tapping the pantry board with the toe of that worn brown boot. She thought about Genevieve, her own mother, buried in the small family plot beyond the windbreak, who had walked the northern strip with her more than once as a child, pointing out the line of old cedar posts that marked where the family's ground stopped and someone else's began. Though Delphine had been too young then to ask why the posts had been set exactly there. She thought last about Bristol, 20 miles east, in a dormitory room she had never seen working through a chapter on constitutional law under a green desk lamp of her own, and Delphine set the coffee down on the drain board and pressed the heels of her hands against the porcelain because she could feel welling up in her chest the small, dangerous mercy of hope, and she was not yet ready to trust it. Toward evening, the rain gave over and a low gold light broke under the clouds across the western fields, and Delphine walked out through the gate and along the fence line to the corner where the old cedar post still stood, weathered silver leaning slightly toward the road. She laid her hand on the top of the nearest post and looked out across the northern strip toward the mound of raw fill in the middle distance. The excavator had gone quiet. At last its bucket lowered its engine off, and the whole field lay in a wet stillness that carried the smell of turned earth and bruised lavender and cold cedar. She thought of the words in the reversion clause of the phrase running with the land through every generation that should hold it, and she thought of her mother saying one summer afternoon, many years ago, as they walked this same fence together, that a farm was not a piece of ground you bought and sold, but a chain you were briefly permitted to hold. Marlo had forged the first link of that chain in 1912. Prudence had polished it with her boot on the pantry floor. Genevieve had walked it with a small daughter and kept it bright. Now Delphine stood at the end of the chain in the last honest light of a rainy Missouri evening, and she understood without any hurry at all that if she let it break here, it would not be reforged. It was hers to carry. She turned back toward the house. The kitchen window burned yellow against the deepening gray, small and steady and unafraid, the same window Reed Kettleman had glanced at from the shoulder of Larkspur Road before dawn, thinking then that it belonged to a woman he could bury as easily as a road. Delphine walked toward that light with her hands loose at her sides and her breath even. And somewhere at the back of her mind, faint but coming clearer, she could hear the toe of a worn brown boot tapping once, twice, 3 times against a pantry floorboard, keeping time with a promise a great-grandmother had made to a daughter she had never lived to meet. Inside, she set the kettle on. She lifted the phone from the sill and dialed the number Winifred Ashby had written on the back of the folder for Ambrose Thorne, and when the old surveyor answered on the second ring in his slow, careful voice, she did not waste his time with a greeting. Ambrose, she said, watching the last of the light drain out of the western sky beyond the sagging barn. I need you to bring the old Platte out to the farm as soon as your week allows. There is a strip of ground along the northern boundary. I need to know exactly where it runs, and I need to know it in numbers no lawyer in Kansas City can talk out from under us. The line was quiet for a long moment on the other end. Then Ambrose Thorne, who had walked the Hollister boundary with Genevieve 12 years before, and had said even less on that day than he had said today, answered her in the same slow voice he used for weather and for weddings and for the deaths of old friends. I will be there Thursday morning, he said. Have coffee ready. Delphine set the phone down. Outside, the wind lifted the wet lavender rose, and somewhere far off across the corridor, a diesel engine coughed once and fell silent. And in the pantry beneath a plain plank of pine, an oilcloth box sat empty at last of its long secret waiting for whatever came next. Ambrose Thorne arrived on Thursday morning with a leather tube of surveys tucked under his arm and a thermos of black coffee he had brought from his own kitchen, because he did not as a rule trouble a woman's stove on a working day. He was tall in the way of men who had spent a life bent over transits, slightly stooped at the shoulders, his hair the color of pewter, his jaw shaved with the careful attention of a man who had lived alone long enough to notice small courtesies. Delphine met him at the porch, took the leather tube from his hand without ceremony, and led him through the mudroom into the kitchen, where she had already laid the 1912 Platte across the checked oilcloth beside a fresh printout of the Redstone site plan that Winifred Ashby had faxed over the evening before. He did not speak for a while. He weighted the corners of both maps with river stones he had brought in a canvas bag for that purpose, adjusted the banker's lamp Winifred had lent her, took a small silver pencil from his shirt pocket, and began. His work was neither fast nor slow. It was the pace of a man who had learned that measurement was the one activity in a compromised world that could still be done honestly, and Delphine understood after the first 5 minutes that she was not to interrupt him. She poured the coffee, she set his cup at his elbow, she stepped back to the sink. He measured for the better part of an hour, moving from one map to the other, muttering figures under his breath in a soft, dry cadence that reminded her of her mother reading recipes aloud. Then he set the silver pencil down on the checked oilcloth, took a slow, careful breath, and turned to look at her over the tops of his reading glasses, with the exact expression he had worn the morning her mother had been buried, which was the closest thing to alarm his face was capable of showing. The northern strip, he told her, tapping the old Platte once with his blunt finger, did not run along some forgotten fringe of the property, the way a person reading Marlowe's letter might have assumed. It ran directly across the planned main gate of the Redstone Inland Port, then straight through the footprint of the stormwater retention basin the state had required as a condition of the environmental permit, and it finished squarely beneath the corporation's primary truck route on the far side of the fence. Vandermeer Meridian had drawn its whole entrance, its whole water plan, and its whole freight logic across a ribbon of ground, whose title, if the reversion clause held, no longer belonged to them at all. Delphine stood at the sink with her hand around a coffee mug she had not yet lifted to her mouth, and she looked at the two maps lying nose to nose under the banker's lamp, and she felt the whole shape of the fight turn over inside her chest. The corporation had been treating her farm as a nuisance at the margin of their vision, a stubborn old thing to be shoved aside. In truth, her ground held the load-bearing bones of the whole $900 million machine, and every hour those bones stayed under her name, the machine was walking on borrowed knees. Ambrose rolled up his surveys, capped his thermos, and left her with the stones still weighting the corners of the maps. On the porch he paused, adjusted the brim of his old felt hat against a wind that had come up off the ridge, and gave her the one sentence he permitted himself all morning. "What do you do next?" he offered in that same slow voice he had used on the phone. "You had better do with your eyes open." Then he was down the steps and gone in his gray sedan, and Delphine stood alone with the two maps and understood at last that she was not merely defending a road. She was standing on a valve the whole project could not function without. Winifred was in Elkin Ford by mid-morning, and by lunchtime her small office above the pharmacy had become the war room of a fight larger than either woman had imagined the week before. She spread Ambrose's overlay across her desk, put on her reading glasses, and studied the two maps in the manner of a general looking at the ground before a battle. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and level, and Delphine heard in it the same quiet, angry patience Winifred had carried down from her office stairs on the day of the widow at Poplar Bluff. "This is not a boundary dispute anymore," Winifred told her without lifting her head from the maps. This is the pinch point of their entire project, and they built it there on paper the state has already stamped. When we say the word rotten, we will not need to whisper. She drafted an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order that afternoon, an ex parte petition asking a county judge to halt all construction on the disputed ground, pending review of the reversion clause, and the sworn representation Vandermeer Meridian had filed with the state. She wrote in the flat, dry style that decades of rural practice had polished into a weapon. No adjectives, no theater, only the deed and the plat, and the sworn certification, and the mound of dirt. Delphine watched over her shoulder as the pages piled up beside the printer. It occurred to her standing there that her grandmother's boot on the pantry board had been the first draft of the same document. Marguerite Vandermeer did not, of course, wait for the courts to act. Word of the filing reached her private office in Kansas City within an hour of the docket clerk in Bell Hollow logging it into the county system, because Marguerite had paid years before for a man in every county courthouse across 4 states to see that word of exactly this sort of paper reached her the moment ink met page. She read the motion through once, laid it face down on the glass surface of her desk, and gave 3 orders in the calm voice she used only when she was truly furious. The first was to her communications director. The second was to her chief counsel. The third was to a private security consultant whose name did not appear on any employee list. Within 3 days, the story in Bell Hollow began to change in exactly the way she had ordered. A profile appeared in the weekly paper describing a lone farmer who, out of selfishness or spite, was standing in the way of hundreds of jobs and holding an entire town's future hostage over what the article delicately called a personal grievance. The piece did not lie outright. It simply arranged its facts so that a woman defending her home looked like a woman extorting a community, and in a town that had already lined up on the side of the money, that was all it took to turn the ambient chill in the diner into something with a harder edge. A hand-painted sign appeared overnight in the window of the feed store on Main. "Support Redstone, save our town." Nobody would admit to putting it there. The pressure came from every direction at once, layered so carefully that no single act of it would ever have justified a call to a county sheriff. Delphine's bank called again about the seasonal operating note this time to say that the loan committee had reviewed her file and would require additional collateral before the next disbursement, more than she had to give. A second heirloom seed buyer, this one in Iowa, canceled a 5-year standing contract in an email that did not mention Vandermeer Meridian by name and did not need to. The propane company that had delivered to the farm since Delphine's mother was still alive left a voicemail regretting a scheduling conflict that would delay the next tank by 3 weeks in November in Missouri, in a house whose baseboards had already begun to whisper of winter. Reed Kettleman kept his machines working right up against her fence line, grating and scraping the earth close enough that the ground trembled beneath her seed beds, and the greenhouse glass fogged over each morning with a fine gray dust. One afternoon, he leaned on her gate while a loader growled behind him, and he offered her his own version of the town's wisdom, in a voice deliberately loud enough for his crew to hear. "You can keep your old piece of paper," he called across the wire, grinning. "We will keep the excavators." Delphine looked at him for a long moment. She did not answer. She only walked back to the house and lifted a small red notebook from the kitchen drawer, and she carried it out to the porch and sat down on the top step in the cold and began to write. Every truck that crossed the disputed corridor she recorded. Every license plate, every date and hour they used the buried right-of-way, every load they hauled across ground the deed said was hers. She turned their contempt into a ledger. They believed she was too small to matter, and they had grown careless in front of her. And she wrote all of it down in a steady hand, page after page of evidence they had handed her for free. A judge in the county courthouse 3 towns over granted the temporary restraining order the following Tuesday morning without fanfare on the strength of Winifred's motion and Ambrose's overlay. The order was narrow, a paragraph and a signature, and it applied only to the disputed portion of the corridor and the northern strip. It felt at first like a small paper barrier against a very large machine. Delphine drove past the padlocked gate that same afternoon on her way back from Elkin Ford and slowed the truck without meaning to, because the excavator sat frozen mid-task, buckets hanging in the air. The whole thundering apparatus of the project stopped dead and silent in the cold sun. She allowed herself exactly one long breath of that image before she drove on. She did not celebrate. She had lived long enough to know that a company that size did not lose its footing without lashing out. The lashing began that night. She had left the porch light on for Bristol because Bristol had said she might drive down over the weekend, and Delphine liked the yellow bulb burning above the mudroom door as a kind of small daughterward beacon across the fields. She had gone to bed early with the red ledger on the nightstand and a paperback she had been trying to finish since August, and she had almost drifted off when she heard the sound she would afterward describe to Winifred in the same flat voice she used for equipment failures as a wrongness in the wind. It was not a shout. It was not a machine. It was the low, soft breath of something taking hold that ought not to have been there at all, and by the time she was on her feet at the bedroom window, her mouth had gone dry. The far corner of this west field had begun to burn. Along a stretch of maybe 40 feet of dormant lavender, a red seam of fire was working its patient way through the dry stems low and steady, a working man's fire, not a lightning strike, not a spark from a passing car. The wind was pushing it eastward, and eastward lay the greenhouse. She was out the door in her boots and her coat with the phone still in her hand, calling the volunteer fire company as she ran, and the operator's voice, calm and small and very far away, told her a truck was already turning out of the station. She reached the corner of the west field with the hose from the barn spigot dragging behind her like a hard black snake, and she turned it on the leading edge of the fire because she could not think of anything else to do. And the water hit the stems and hissed and threw back an angry white steam that smelled of scorched lavender and wet iron. It was Reed Kettleman's night off, but the men at the far end of the quarter had not been idle. Somewhere in the middle distance along the western fence, a set of headlights kicked on and swung wide across the field, illuminating for one bright second a break in her fence wire where the strands had been snipped clean by a good pair of side cutters and rolled back like the corner of a page. By the time the volunteer truck rocked into the yard, she had held the fire off the greenhouse by 6 feet and no more. The volunteers finished what she had begun with a professional efficiency that made her for the first time all night want to sit down in the dirt, but she did not. She stood at the corner of the west field with her hand around the shut-off valve and watched the last red seam die under the boots of a man she had known since Sunday school. And when the county sheriff arrived at last, 35 minutes after the fire company, he took her statement in a low, respectful voice and examined the cut fence wire with a flashlight and told her in a tone she recognized at once that with no witnesses to the act itself, he could not promise her that the office would find the person responsible. She did not argue with him. She stood in the cold with the smell of scorched lavender in her hair and understood with the same clarity she had understood the mound of dirt on the road that the fire had not been an accident and had not been meant to burn the whole farm to the ground. It had been meant to say something to her. It had been meant to say that the mound of dirt out at the fence line was only the first tool in the box. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the red ledger open and a fresh page ready, and she wrote down the time the fire had started in the direction of the wind and the make of the truck she had seen for a half second in her own headlights when the arsonist had bolted for the road, and she wrote down the fact that the cut in the fence had been made from her side. Then she closed the ledger, laid her forehead on the checked oilcloth for the space of 3 breaths, and got up to make more coffee, because Bristol was going to call in the morning, and she was going to have to find a way to keep her daughter from hearing the fear in her voice. Bristol called at 7. She had been up since 5, she said, because a friend from home whose father worked at the volunteer fire station had texted her at 4 to ask whether her mother was all right. Delphine held the phone against her ear at the kitchen sink and told her daughter in a voice she was proud of that the fire had been small, that the greenhouse was fine, that the sheriff was investigating. Bristol did not accept any of it. She said she was already packing an overnight bag. She said she would drive down that afternoon. She said no. Delphine's chest tightened as the words slipped out. I don't want you here right now. Bristol didn't flinch on the other end of the line. I don't much care what you want, her voice steady, more resolve than argument. That was the end of the conversation. The line clicked off. Delphine set the phone down on the checked oilcloth with the small, precise care of a woman who has decided not to break the receiver, and she stood at the sink for a long time, watching a pair of chickadees at the feeder, because a person had to look at something while the fear worked its way through the chest and back down again. The fear did not have time to finish its circuit. Bristol pulled into the yard a little after 4 in a small green hatchback with a Missouri parking sticker on the windshield, and her jaw set in the exact line Genevieve had used to wear when Delphine had done something particularly foolish as a girl. She did not embrace her mother in the yard. She lifted her bag from the passenger seat, walked to the porch, and only in the mudroom with her boots off did she permit herself to put her arms around Delphine's neck for the space of one long exhale. Then she stepped back, brisk as a nurse. "I need to show you something," she told Delphine in the same low voice Delphine had used to her on the phone the night the deed was found. She unzipped her overnight bag, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and set it on the checked oilcloth. Inside were 3 10-by-8 photographs printed on cheap glossy paper, and a plain white business envelope, and a folded sheet of stationery from a hotel in Colombia that Delphine did not recognize. The photographs had been taken with a long lens. 2 of them showed Bristol walking across the quad between the library and her dormitory, her face partly hidden by a knit cap, her breath white in the cold. The third had been taken through the front window of the coffee shop where Bristol worked on Wednesday and Friday afternoons. Delphine stared at the third photograph the longest, because in it her daughter was smiling at a customer unaware, and someone had circled the customer in red marker as though to say, "We know who your friends are." The business envelope contained $1,000 in $50 bills. The stationery from the hotel in Colombia carried 3 lines of computer printing on it. No signature, no letterhead beyond the hotel's. "Tell your mother she should be reasonable. There are people who care about what happens next to you. There are also people who do not." Delphine read those 3 sentences twice. She folded the paper. She folded it again. She set it on top of the photographs, put her hand flat over the pile, as though holding down a struggling animal, and she looked across the checked oilcloth at her 19-year-old daughter and understood in one clean, terrible instant that the mound of dirt at the fence line had never been the point. Bristol did not cry. She told her mother in the same steady voice that she had walked directly from the hotel where the envelope had been left with a fake room number to the campus police, and from there to her academic dean, and from there to a young woman lawyer who volunteered at the university's legal aid clinic, and that all 3 of those parties now had copies of everything on the table. She said further that her 3 roommates had been briefed. She said her Wednesday and Friday shifts at the coffee shop had been reassigned to other people until the matter was resolved. She said last that her father, who had walked out of both of their lives when she was 4, had called her out of nowhere the afternoon before to offer in a slightly slurred voice to come to Columbia and defend her, and she had declined. "I am telling you all of this," Bristol added, "so that you do not spend the drive back tonight imagining that I am unprotected." Then she sat down at the kitchen table across from her mother and did not say another word for a while, because sometimes a daughter needs to leave her mother alone with a piece of paper in order for the mother to make her way through what the paper contains, and Bristol Hollister had grown up in a house where women knew that particular grace. Delphine did not that night know herself to be about to fold. She only knew that when Bristol went upstairs to the small bedroom that had been hers as a child, and when the house had gone quiet, except for the whisper of the propane furnace and the distant grumble of the wind against the eaves, Delphine sat down at the kitchen table with the 3 photographs and the $1,000 in 50s and the 3-line letter, and she began slowly to weigh the fight in a coldly practical way. She had refused to weigh it since the morning the road had been buried. She thought about Bristol's tuition. She thought about the seasonal operating note. She thought about the propane truck that would not come for another 3 weeks. She thought about the last honest year of income the farm had produced, which had not been enough to cover the balance she owed her feed supplier, let alone the retainer she had already handed Winifred. She thought about the sheriff's flashlight on the cut wire and the calm official voice explaining that with no witnesses, he could not promise her anything. She thought about the photographs of her daughter walking across a quad in a knit cap and about the small red circle drawn around a stranger in a coffee shop window. She got up. She lifted a lined yellow legal pad from the top of the refrigerator where she kept it for grocery lists, and she carried it back to the table. She wrote in her steady farmer's hand a letter of surrender addressed to Vandermeer Meridian Development, offering to sell the northern strip and the road easement outright for a figure she calculated in the margin, an amount high enough to pay off the note and cover Bristol's remaining tuition and leave a small stake for a modest life somewhere the corporation would never bother to find them. She signed the letter Delphine Marlowe Hollister. She addressed it. She sealed it in an envelope. She set it on the checked oilcloth beside the three photographs. She turned off the low bulb over the sink. She stood a while in the dark. She thought about how much easier her mother's life would have been if Genevieve had on any of the difficult days quietly signed away the ground and moved to a small town where nobody knew her. She thought about how much easier Prudence's life would have been if she had done the same. She thought about Marlowe Threadgill Hollister in the winter of 1912, sitting at some earlier version of this table, with a child asleep upstairs and a fight against the Kansas and Southern Railroad still fresh on her hands. She looked up in the dark at the tint-type portrait of Marlowe that had hung on this kitchen wall for as long as Delphine had been alive. A small brown oval of a young woman with a plain collar and a steady mouth, and eyes that in this light seemed to look at Delphine and through her at the same time. Marlowe had not sold to the ground. Marlowe had ridden into Jefferson City with a single old survey and the testimony of two neighbors who had died before Delphine was born, and she had walked out of that courthouse with the corridor still in her name. Marlowe had written a clause into a deed with the express expectation that a woman she would never live to meet might one dark night sit at this table with a letter of surrender in her hand and need reminding. Delphine sat back down at the table. She picked up the sealed envelope. She turned it over twice in her hands. Then she opened the drawer under the checked oilcloth and took out the pair of kitchen shears her mother had used for 30 years to trim the ends of lavender bundles at the sink, and she cut the envelope down its long axis in one clean stroke, and then across its short axis, and then across the pieces again. She did not tear it. She cut it carefully with the shears into ribbons narrow enough to burn cleanly in the wood stove. She dropped the ribbons through the stove door onto the low bed of embers, and she watched the paper darken and curl and go. And she said to the empty kitchen in a voice too quiet for anyone but herself, and possibly a woman 100 years gone to hear the rich can buy land, but they can't buy back what my great-grandmother wrote into it. She stood a long moment with her hand on the warm cast iron of the stove door. Then she went and made herself a fresh pot of coffee, because she had a red ledger to keep filling and a state hearing to prepare for, and she was not, as it turned out, done. In the morning, Bristol came down to a mother who looked as though she had slept 2 hours and was somehow the steadier for it. Over coffee, Delphine laid out for her daughter plainly and without softening any of it what the corporation had done, and what she believed they would try next, and what she intended to do about it. And she asked Bristol to go back to Columbia that afternoon, not because she was sending her away, but because the fight now needed a Hollister on both ends of the highway. Bristol listened without interrupting. When Delphine finished, Bristol reached across the table and put her hand over her mother's, and she said, "Only all right, Mama. I'll be your East End." Then she went upstairs to pack. Delphine drove her daughter as far as the county line herself in the pickup, with the young woman lawyer from the campus legal aid clinic already on the phone via Bristol's speaker to set up a follow-up meeting with the university's dean of students. And when Bristol transferred to her own hatchback at a truck stop just off the interstate, Delphine took her daughter's face in both hands and told her, in the level voice that had become the voice of the whole fight, that she was the 4th generation of Hollister women on that ground, and that meant she had every right in the world to stand up straight. Bristol drove east. Delphine drove west. Neither of them looked back because both of them had been raised not to. The County Planning Commission had scheduled its regular meeting for the last Thursday of the month at the Bell Hollow Grange Hall, and when Winifred called Delphine on Tuesday afternoon to tell her that the Redstone project was on the agenda, Delphine understood that the corporation had chosen its ground for the next round of the fight. The Grange Hall was theirs. It was where the local ladies' auxiliary served coffee under the picture of the founding members. It was where the Vandermeer renderings had been unveiled to applause. It was where, if she stood up to speak, half the room would already be looking at their shoes. She spent the day before the meeting in Winifred's office rehearsing nothing because Winifred did not believe in rehearsal, and Ambrose sat in the corner cleaning the lenses of his transit and offering from time to time the sort of one-sentence observation he seemed to have been saving up since the last century. "They will bring the drawings," he told her once without looking up from the lens. "Bring the old plat and let it sit under yours. Let the room see them without hearing you say a word." Winifred nodded. Delphine watched them one at a time and understood without having to be told that neither of them had ever won a fight by shouting. She drove back to the farm that evening under a low autumn sky the color of pewter, and the pickup rattled over the last of the detour. And when she turned into her own yard, she saw waiting on the porch with her back against the door and a large canvas tote bag at her feet. A stranger. The stranger stood up when Delphine cut the engine. She was somewhere in her mid-50s with dark red hair, beginning to gray at the temples, dressed in a plain wool coat and sensible boots. And she carried herself with the particular, alert stillness of a woman who had spent a lifetime taking notes in rooms she was not supposed to speak in. She did not step off the porch. She waited until Delphine climbed the steps, and only then did she offer her hand. "My name is Harlan Wexford," she began in a low, careful voice. "I worked in the records office at Vandermeer Meridian Development for 15 years. I was let go 3 months ago. I saw the fire in the paper this morning. I need to tell you what I know before somebody else tells you a version of it that isn't true." Delphine looked at her for a long moment on the porch, and the wind lifted a lock of the woman's graying hair and set it down again. Then Delphine opened the door and gestured her inside without a word, because sometimes the small, careful courtesy of a doorway is the only welcome a stranger has earned and the only one you have to give. They sat at the kitchen table. Delphine set out coffee. Harlan Wexford did not drink hers. She reached into the canvas tote bag and lifted out a plain brown accordion folder, and she opened it on the checked oilcloth and turned it so Delphine could see. Inside were printouts, emails, internal memoranda from the corporation's Kansas City office dated across the 11 months preceding the morning. The trucks had come to Larkspur Road, each one-time stamped and CC line intact, each one showing the addresses of people who did not know when they had written them that a records clerk in the basement was quietly making herself a private archive. "I did not steal them," Harlan said in the same careful voice. "I printed them under my own login while I was still an employee, and I took them home the day I was let go, because I had begun to understand what they were doing here, and I did not, in my own house, on my own conscience, feel able to leave them behind. I have not shown them to anyone. I did not know who to give them to. I read your name in the county paper this week. Then last night I saw the piece on the fire." She stopped there. She looked down at her hands. Delphine did not touch the folder yet. She looked first at the woman across the table, at the way her hands were folded very tightly around each other on the checked oilcloth, at the way her mouth had settled into a line that Delphine recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror the morning after the fire. And Delphine understood without having to be told that Harlan Wexford had not driven 3 hours from Kansas City with a brown accordion folder because she believed in the little farmer against the big corporation. She had driven 3 hours because she had helped in her quiet, dutiful way to file and copy and organize the paperwork on the buried road, while telling herself it was somebody else's decision. And she had woken up one night knowing that if she did not at last walk up somebody's porch steps with these pages in her hand, she would not be able to look her own face in the shaving mirror for the rest of her life. Delphine reached across the table, then slowly and laid her hand over Harlan's for the space of one long breath. She did not thank her. She did not speak. She only met the woman's eyes once in acknowledgement. Then she drew the folder toward her and began to read. She read for the better part of an hour with Harlan sitting silent across the table, and the coffee cooling untouched in both cups, and the wind rising outside against the sagging planks of the barn. She read a memorandum from an in-house counsel of Vandermeer Meridian, dated 11 months before the morning of the trucks, warning Marguerite Vandermeer in cautious, lawyerly language that Larkspur Road might be an unresolved private right-of-way, a genuine and serious cloud on the title of the corridor. She read the meeting minutes of a Kansas City strategy session in which one director had asked in plain terms whether the ground had been quiet titled, and had been told in equally plain terms that a full quiet title action would take 8 to 11 months and would slow the whole development past the tax incentive deadline. She read finally the email that turned the room quiet, even though the room was quiet already. It had been written by Marguerite Vandermeer to Reed Kettleman 3 weeks before the trucks had come on a Sunday afternoon at 11 minutes past 4. The subject line said only Larkspur, and the body of it was 2 sentences. "If the farmer will not sign bury the road first, she will not have the money to react in time." Delphine read it twice. Then she set the printout down on the checked oilcloth with the careful precision of a woman handling something that could still detonate. And she looked up at Harlan Wexford, and she said in a voice she was proud of, "Thank you for driving all this way, and I would like you to consider staying the night, because I do not want you on that highway with these papers in your car, and I do not want you alone at home either, until Winifred and I have decided how best to protect you." Harlan Wexford did not cry, but her shoulders lowered by half an inch, and Delphine understood the small, unspeakable relief of a woman whose fear had, for the first time in 3 months, been named out loud by someone else. Delphine made up the small bedroom that had been Genevieve's as a young wife. She poured Harlan a fresh cup of coffee she would actually drink. Then she picked up the phone from the windowsill and called Winifred Ashby in Elkin Ford. And when Winifred answered on the second ring in the same low and hurried voice with which she had answered every call in the past 3 weeks, Delphine spoke into the receiver in the same voice so that the fear in her own chest would not be heard. "We have a witness," Delphine told her, a former records clerk from inside Vandermeer Meridian. "She has driven 3 hours to my kitchen with a brown accordion folder." Winifred, they knew about Larkspur Road 11 months before they buried it. It is in writing in Marguerite's own hand. She wrote to Kettleman 3 weeks before the trucks came and told him to bury the road so I would not have the money to react in time. The line was very quiet on the other end. Winifred Ashby did not at first speak. When she did, her voice had the particular hush of a woman who had waited 20 years for exactly this call and had not until this moment been sure it would ever come. "Delphine," she said, "don't you touch those papers again tonight without gloves. Put them in the pantry, under the board. I will be at your house before sunrise." She paused. Then she added the second sentence more quietly. "And Delphine, now they are the ones who will not have time to react." Delphine set the phone down. She turned to Harlan Wexford, still seated at the kitchen table, with her hands folded very tightly around each other, and she said gently, "Why don't we get you upstairs? The Grange Hall meeting is Thursday. We have a lot to do before then." Outside, the wind that had come up off the ridge picked at the eaves of the old farmhouse, and somewhere in the dark middle distance along the buried corridor, a security floodlight snapped on and washed the mound of raw fill in a cold white glare. And Delphine Hollister stood in the mudroom doorway with the brown accordion folder held against her chest, and understood without any particular joy that the fight had at last reached the stage that could not be walked back. The corporation had believed it was dealing with a woman alone, and it had made, in the manner of corporations, the mistake of every generation of men who had ever underestimated the women of this land. They had left a paper trail. They had chosen a records clerk to fire without asking themselves what she carried home in her head. They had put in writing on a Sunday afternoon at 11 minutes past 4 a sentence they believed nobody outside their building would ever read. Delphine climbed the stairs behind Harlan Wexford with the folder in her hand and the fixed calm of a woman who had at last seen the shape of the whole battle. She showed Harlan to the small bedroom that had been Genevieve's. She wished her good night. She went back down to the kitchen. She lifted the pantry board once more, laid the brown accordion folder inside the box beside the letter Marlowe Threadgill Hollister had written to a daughter in 1912, and pressed the plank down flat with the palm of her hand. Then she stood a long moment in the dark, listening to the wind, listening to the low breath of her own house. Somewhere upstairs above her head, a stranger who had driven 3 hours out of conscience was easing herself into sleep on Genevieve Hollister's old bed. Somewhere 20 miles east, in a dormitory in Columbia, a 19-year-old woman was studying constitutional law under a green desk lamp with the door locked and 3 roommates briefed and a young lawyer's number in her phone. Somewhere off to the west, in a glass and steel office in Kansas City, a woman in charcoal wool and platinum earrings was at that same hour unaware that a Sunday afternoon email had made its quiet way across a state to a farmhouse pantry, and that a Grange Hall in Bell Hollow was on Thursday evening going to become the room in which her whole careful architecture began to fall. Delphine turned off the low bulb over the sink. She stood in the dark kitchen a while longer with her hand flat against the pantry board, and she said very quietly to nobody in particular and to everybody in her line, "All right, Mama. All right, Marlowe. I hear you." Then she went to bed. Winifred Ashby's gray sedan turned into the yard before the horizon had begun to lighten headlights, washing the porch in a cold wash, and she climbed the steps, carrying a second brown accordion folder of her own and a plain wooden box the size of a shoebox. Inside the box lay a set of cotton archivist's gloves, a stack of clear plastic sleeves, a portable scanner she had bought years ago for exactly this kind of morning, and a small tape recorder. She did not on the porch waste time on greeting. She met Delphine's eyes in the yellow bulb light and moved past her into the kitchen the way a country doctor moves past a father in a hospital corridor toward a room where the work waits. They laid Harlan Wexford's papers out across the checked oilcloth in the order the woman had originally filed them, and Winifred put on the cotton gloves and read every page aloud into the small tape recorder slowly, so that any court which later demanded a chain of custody could hear a 60-year-old rural attorney narrating each document into evidence at 4:30 in the morning in a farmhouse in Missouri. Harlan came downstairs at first light in the shirt she had slept in, and Winifred took a full statement from her at the table, one careful question at a time, while Delphine kept the coffee coming and stayed out of the way, because she had already understood that her job now was to let the professionals do the work she had spent a lifetime being told she could not do herself. By 10 in the morning, Winifred had a signed and notarized affidavit from Harlan Wexford, a scanned digital copy of every printout in the folder stored on two separate drives, and a plan for the woman's short-term safety that involved a spare bedroom at Winifred's own sister's place in Elkin Ford until the state hearing was over. By noon, she had drafted a supplemental filing that added the emails, the affidavit, and the Sunday afternoon message from Marguerite Vandermeer to Reed Kettleman to the existing petition, and she had transmitted the whole package by encrypted upload to the state administrative panel that oversaw large development permits. By early afternoon, she had filed a criminal complaint with the state attorney general's office, alleging false statement in a permit application, and a separate complaint with the county prosecutor, alleging conspiracy to commit malicious burning of agricultural property, naming Reed Kettleman by role and title and leaving room for the investigation to fill in the rest. The state hearing had already been scheduled for the following Monday. Winifred did not, in the days that stood between them and that morning, tell Delphine what to say or how to say it. She only told her once, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, with the tape recorder finally packed away, that the woman who had cut a letter of surrender into ribbons with a pair of kitchen shears did not need coaching. She needed sleep. Delphine tried for Winifred's sake to take that advice. She managed most nights about 4 hours. The Grange Hall meeting that Thursday came and went with less drama than the corporation had planned for it, because the corporation had not yet learned about Harlan Wexford, and because Winifred had made the calculated choice to hold the emails for the state hearing where they would have the force of sworn evidence rather than spend them in a room where the County Planning Commission could only offer opinions. So Marguerite Vandermeer came to Bell Hollow that Thursday evening with an entourage of attorneys and engineers and a press aide, and she gave a smooth, well-practiced presentation about jobs and cold storage and tax base and the future. And she gestured at one point in her remarks toward Delphine, seated in the second row beside Winifred, and she used the phrase, "a single family's private grievance," in a tone meant to draw a small collective sigh out of the crowd. The room sighed. Delphine did not respond. Winifred did not respond. Ambrose, seated one chair over with the leather tube of surveys across his knees, did not so much as blink. When it came Delphine's turn to speak, she stood at the little wooden podium and did not raise her voice, and she did not talk about herself. She read into the record in her steady farmer's voice the reversion clause from the 1912 deed, and then Winifred stood beside her and laid the old plat on the folding table at the front of the hall, next to the corporation's site rendering. And Ambrose, without a word, spread his overlay across both. A few polite laughs traveled around the back of the room from people who could not quite believe a 100-year-old paper could hold a $900 million project by the throat, and Winifred let those laughs finish, and then said only very quietly, "We will see." Then she thanked the commission and helped Delphine gather the maps, and the three of them walked out through a hall that had gone without anyone quite realizing, when it had happened, a good deal quieter than it had been at the start. Marguerite Vandermeer was in the parking lot when they came out. She had left her entourage inside, and she was standing beside her black sedan with her arms folded across her charcoal wool coat and her platinum earrings catching the sodium light in tight, controlled sparks. And she watched Delphine cross the gravel toward the pickup with an expression that Delphine, who had been reading livestock and weather all her adult life, understood at once. It was the expression of a person who had begun for the first time to consider that she had been wrong about something. "You are enjoying this," Marguerite offered, her voice pitched to carry only the 10 feet between them. Delphine stopped at the driver's door with her hand on the handle and looked at the other woman across the hood, and for a long half-second, the sodium light held them both. "I have not enjoyed a single day of this," Delphine answered, in a voice as level as the parking lot. "You will not enjoy the next one." Then she climbed into the pickup and drove home along the detour with Winifred behind her in the sedan, and neither woman spoke on the CB. Monday morning came with a low sky and the smell of first frost, and the state hearing convened in the third-floor conference chamber of the administrative building in Jefferson City, and by the time Delphine and Winifred stepped through the security check at the ground floor entrance, they could see through the glass doors that the corporation had chartered a small army, 2 attorneys from a Kansas City firm, 2 more from Chicago, a pair of engineers in tailored jackets, a woman from the press office of Vandermeer Meridian with a leather binder held against her chest. Sterling Beaumont III himself, the billionaire whose money underwrote the project, sat in the front row of the observer gallery in a charcoal suit that had been cut for him personally. In another century, his hands folded in his lap, his silver hair combed straight back, his very stillness, a kind of authority, the room could feel from the door. Delphine took her seat at the petitioner's table beside Winifred, with Ambrose in the chair behind them, and Harlan Wexford, at Winifred's careful instruction, waiting quietly in a small side room across the corridor with an investigator from the state attorney general's office. Delphine set her hands flat on the polished wood in front of her and looked once briefly at Marguerite Vandermeer seated across the aisle. Marguerite did not look back. The lead attorney for Vandermeer Meridian rose first, a tall man in a gray pinstripe who had come down from Chicago that morning and who spoke in the smooth, faintly amused cadence of a man who had never lost a hearing of this kind and had no expectation of losing one now. He described the 1912 deed as a piece of antique language whose enforceability had been overtaken decades ago by modern zoning and eminent domain doctrine. He described the reversion clause as ambiguous, aspirational, unbounded in time, quite possibly void as against public policy. He described the petitioner in careful terms as a sympathetic figure whose personal circumstances did not, however, entitle her to hold a regional economic development project hostage over what he called twice an old private grievance. He worked hard and he worked well. For the better part of an hour, the panel appeared inclined to listen. Winifred rose to answer. She was not loud, she was not fast. She was in that room of tailored jackets, an older woman in a plain navy blazer and sensible shoes, with a scarred leather trial binder open in her hands, and Delphine watched 3 of the corporation's attorneys one by one register at the edge of their vision that they had underestimated her. Winifred walked the panel through the chain of title from 1912 to the present taxpayer by taxpayer, deed record by deed record, without missing a single quarterly filing. She asked Ambrose Thorne to come forward, and Ambrose laid the old plat next to the site plan and traced with his blunt finger and his slow, careful voice the line of the northern strip through the gate, the retention basin, the truck route. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. Then Winifred took off her reading glasses and folded them very carefully on the table in front of her, and she reached into her briefcase and lifted out the supplemental filing, and she looked once at Delphine, and Delphine gave the smallest nod. Winifred turned to the panel. There is, she informed them in the same low, unhurried voice she had used in her office above the pharmacy on the first morning Delphine had climbed those stairs, additional evidence bearing directly on the sworn representations Vandermeer Meridian filed with this state in support of its permit application. With the panel's permission, I would like to read from 3 internal communications of the respondent corporation, produced this weekend under proper chain of custody, authenticated by affidavit of a former employee and now part of the record. The lead attorney for Vandermeer Meridian was on his feet, at once objecting to authenticity, objecting to relevance, objecting to prejudice, objecting to procedure. The chair of the panel, a woman with white hair and rimless glasses, who had spent 30 years in state administrative law, let him finish and then overruled him without expression. Winifred began to read. She read the 11-month-old memorandum in which an in-house counsel of Vandermeer Meridian had warned Marguerite Vandermeer in careful, lawyerly language that Larkspur Road might constitute an unresolved private right-of-way and a genuine cloud on the title of the corridor. She read the minutes of the Kansas City strategy meeting at which the option of a full, quiet title action had been raised and rejected on grounds of time and cost. She read then in the same slow, deliberate cadence she had used to narrate every document into the tape recorder in Delphine's kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, the Sunday afternoon email from Marguerite Vandermeer to Reed Kettleman, dated 3 weeks before the trucks had come, the one whose subject line read only Larkspur, whose body read 2 sentences. If the farmer will not sign bury the road first, she will not have the money to react in time. Winifred set the page down on the table in front of her. She did not add anything to it. She did not need to. In the silence that followed, Delphine heard more clearly than she had ever heard it in her life, the small mechanical tick of an old wall clock at the back of the chamber, and she understood in that tick that the fight was at last over. What remained was only the settling of accounts. The panel chair asked Marguerite Vandermeer to remain seated for a moment. She turned to the lead attorney and asked whether counsel wished to be heard on the authentication of the emails. The lead attorney rose, slowly opened his mouth, closed it, and asked for a brief recess to consult with his client. The chair granted him 10 minutes. Marguerite left the room by a side door with her attorneys around her like a color guard. Sterling Beaumont III did not leave with them. He remained in the front row of the observer gallery with his hands folded in his lap, and when Marguerite passed his row, he did not look at her, and Delphine, who was watching, saw Marguerite's step falter for exactly one syllable before she recovered it. The recess became 15 minutes, then 20. Winifred sat very still at the petitioner's table, her hands folded over her binder, and did not speak. Ambrose sat behind them in the same posture. Delphine, unable to sit any longer, rose and walked out into the corridor. Sterling Beaumont III was standing at the far end of it beside a tall window that looked out across the Capitol grounds. He had a phone against his ear. He was not raising his voice. Delphine did not approach him. She only walked to the drinking fountain 20 feet from where he stood, drank, straightened, and stayed there long enough to hear the shape of his call without hearing its content. He was speaking in the calm cadence of a man who had built and unbuilt a great many things in his life to somebody on the other end of the line about a disbursement. The word he used twice was frozen. Delphine went back into the chamber and sat down. She told Winifred under her breath what she had overheard. Winifred did not smile exactly. Her mouth relaxed by about a quarter of an inch. That she offered in a voice pitched only for Delphine is the sound of a $900 million project realizing it needs a new place to sleep tonight. The panel reconvened. The lead attorney for Vandermeer Meridian rose, and in a voice that had lost half a register of its earlier smoothness, requested that the panel adjourn the hearing to allow the corporation an opportunity to review the emails and prepare a response. The chair looked at him over the tops of her rimless glasses. She looked at the lead attorney. She looked at Marguerite Vandermeer, who had returned to her seat. She looked at last at Delphine, and her expression, without changing at all, communicated more clearly than any spoken word that this was the moment. The chair, in the same neutral administrative voice with which she had opened the proceeding, extended the existing temporary restraining order to cover the entire disputed portion of the Redstone Inland Port project, ordered Vandermeer Meridian Development to resubmit its land and access certifications under fresh review, referred the matter of the sworn statement in the permit application to the State Attorney General's office for potential criminal investigation, and in the last sentence of her ruling suspended the corporation's active construction permit pending resolution. She thanked the parties for their time. She rose. She left the chamber by the door behind the panel table. For a moment, nobody in the room moved. Then the smaller sounds of a room after a verdict began to unfold: the click of pens being capped, the scrape of a chair, the low murmur of one of the Chicago attorneys speaking urgently into the ear of the man beside him. Delphine did not stand. She did not look at Winifred. She did not smile. She looked once across the aisle at Marguerite Vandermeer. Marguerite, for the first time in the whole proceeding, met her eyes. They held that look for a long, unbroken moment across a room that had gone very quiet, and Delphine saw pass across the other woman's face in slow order denial and calculation, in something that was not quite yet but might in time become understanding. Then Marguerite looked away first. It was Delphine this time who did not. They drove back to Bell Hollow that afternoon under a low blue sky, and Winifred took the wheel of the sedan because Delphine was at last too tired to drive safely. Ambrose sat in the back seat with his hat in his lap and the leather tube of surveys upright between his knees, and he offered 20 miles east of Jefferson City the one sentence he permitted himself for the whole return trip. Your great-grandmother, he told Delphine without looking at her, would have liked that room today. Delphine, watching the flat brown fields slide past the window, understood it as the closest thing to a benediction Ambrose Thorne had ever spoken aloud in her hearing. The corporation did not in the days that followed sit still. It could not afford to. The state hearing had already begun to reshape the ground beneath Vandermeer Meridian's feet in ways that could not be undone by any Sunday afternoon email. The subcontractors who had built their fall schedules around the Redstone project began to file claims for the cost of the shutdown. The Iowa buyer who had canceled Delphine's contract in October called Winifred's office, quietly asking whether the offer might be reinstated for the following season. Two of the county board members, who had joked in the diner about shovels and hen houses, stopped Delphine outside the feed store the following Saturday, and in the manner of men who had spent a lifetime avoiding apology, tried something close to it. Delphine let them try. She thanked them. She did not linger. The larger papers had begun to notice. A regional reporter from Kansas City drove down to Bell Hollow with a photographer and a list of questions, and Winifred, who had spent 30 years distrusting reporters, sat with Delphine at Delphine's own kitchen table across from the young woman and answered each question in a measured voice. Delphine, when it came her turn, declined to be photographed at the buried mound. She permitted one image taken with her permission of her hand resting on the corner of the checked oilcloth beside a corner of Marlowe's letter, and nothing else. The reporter, sensing what she had been given, did not press for more. Sterling Beaumont III called Winifred's office 2 days after the state hearing. He did not identify himself when the receptionist answered, but he did not need to. He asked with the elaborate politeness of a very rich man who has decided to solve a problem outside a courtroom, whether Winifred and her client would consider meeting with him privately in a neutral location of Winifred's choosing, without Marguerite Vandermeer present. Winifred, without consulting Delphine, told him that any meeting would take place at Delphine Hollister's kitchen table, that Delphine would decide who else was present, that no recording would be permitted on either side, and that it would occur only after Sterling had, in writing, retracted the sworn statement filed with the state and issued a public correction. He agreed on the phone to all three conditions in about 90 seconds. Delphine set out an extra cup on the checked oilcloth the following Tuesday morning. Sterling Beaumont III arrived alone in a plain black car, driven by no one Delphine recognized, and he climbed the porch steps by himself with a manila envelope tucked under his arm. And when Delphine opened the door, he did not offer his hand. He nodded to her the way one professional nods to another across a fence line. She showed him into the kitchen. She poured him coffee. He set the manila envelope on the table between them, and with a single motion of his index finger slid it across. Inside was a signed, notarized statement withdrawing the sworn representation in the original permit filing that the site carried no unresolved right-of-way dispute. Attached to it was a copy of a public correction that would run at his personal direction in the same papers that had originally announced the Redstone project a year and a half earlier. Delphine read both documents twice, while Sterling Beaumont III drank his coffee and looked once at the tint-type portrait of Marlowe Threadgill Hollister above the sink. He did not, when he spoke, waste time with preamble. Marguerite, he told her in the same quiet voice with which he had spoken into the phone in the corridor of the administrative building, will not be running Vandermeer Meridian by the end of the month. He paused. That is a matter for our internal board, and it is unrelated to whatever we now agree at this table. But I wanted you to know it. I wanted you to know it from me. Then he leaned back a little in his chair and set his coffee cup down and told her plainly that he had come to ask what she required. Delphine did not at that table humiliate him. She did not need to. She had watched on the drive back from Jefferson City the whole shape of the last month settle into a form she could carry, and she had understood that the only thing worth requiring now was the thing she had wanted since the morning her boot had come off the gas pedal in front of a wall of dirt. She wanted the ground restored. She wanted her losses covered. She wanted her right-of-way written into a public record in language that no future project could quietly bury. She wanted a protective corridor of farmland along her fence line that Vandermeer Meridian and its successors would agree in binding form never to encroach upon. If they still needed the northern strip for their retention basin, they would lease it at its actual strategic value on a term of years, with annual escalators tied to the true worth of a thing the whole project could not function without. She named those terms one at a time in her steady voice at her own table, in the very room in which the deed had lain hidden beneath the floor. Sterling Beaumont III listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he did not counteroffer. That is a fair price, he told her in a voice that had, for the first time in the whole visit, a small note of something almost like relief. It is a great deal more than we hope to pay. It is a great deal less than the alternative. He paused. He looked again at the tint-type portrait. Your great-grandmother, he added in a tone Delphine had not expected would have been a formidable competitor. Then he lifted his coffee. He drained it. He stood up. He asked at the door whether she would permit him to shake her hand. Delphine considered him for a long moment. Then she extended her own, and they shook once briefly the way a farmer and a rancher shake at the closing of a good sale. He walked down the porch steps. His plain black car turned out of the yard. Delphine stood in the mudroom doorway watching until the dust from the drive settled again, and then she went back into the kitchen and stood a while with her hands flat on the checked oilcloth, because a person had to stand still after something like that and let the room take it in. Marguerite Vandermeer was in fact removed from the office of Chief Executive of Vandermeer Meridian Development within 11 days. The board did not issue a statement beyond the usual language about pursuing new opportunities. A regional business paper reported it in the tone reserved for such announcements. Delphine did not, when she read the piece the following Sunday, feel any particular thing about it. It was in the end the least of the day's news. Reed Kettleman was arrested a week later. The county prosecutor, working with an investigator from the state fire marshal's office, had traced the arsonist Delphine had glimpsed for a half second in her headlights to a man in Springfield who had been paid $500 in cash and a promise of more if the job produced results. And that man offered a reduction on his own charge, had named Reed Kettleman as the person who had hired him. Reed Kettleman turned in his interview with investigators exactly the color of a man who has finally understood that he has been left holding the bag on behalf of people who no longer take his calls. The state contractors licensing board suspended his credential the following week. A civil suit filed by Delphine with Winifred's careful pen behind it would in due course cost him a good deal more than his license. The mound of dirt came down in the first mild week of March. Vandermeer Meridian sent the same class of trucks that had put the fill in place, but this time they came in the daylight in single file at a legal speed, and they hauled the dirt back to the county pit from which it had originally been taken. Delphine did not stand at her fence line to watch. Winifred did on her behalf all afternoon, with her arms folded across her plain navy blazer and her mouth set in a line that Delphine, when she finally drove out to join her at 4 in the afternoon, understood at once as satisfaction. The people of Bell Hollow gathered along the section line in small, quiet groups as the corridor emerged foot by foot from beneath the mound, and there was something almost solemn in the way they watched, because the very thing that had been meant to erase her was rising in front of them into the daylight. The banker who had joked about the shovel in the henhouse crossed the diner one morning the following week to offer, in a red-faced, clumsy voice, an apology across the counter. Delphine, who had ordered coffee and a slice of pie she did not particularly want, listened without interrupting. She thanked him for coming over. She did not either then or later resume banking at his branch. A handful of local farmers began to seek out Winifred's small office above the pharmacy in Elkin Ford in the weeks that followed, quietly one at a time, with old boxes and folders and manila envelopes from attics and desk drawers, asking her whether she would take a look at the deeds behind their own land. Winifred, who had spent 30 years being told that country practice was small work, cleared her Tuesday and Thursday afternoons and set aside a reduced fee for the first hour of any such consultation. And Delphine, without being asked, contributed a small annual sum from the settlement into a fund at Winifred's office to cover the costs of any local family whose paperwork required a survey it could not otherwise afford. She insisted in the paperwork setting up the fund that her name not appear on any of it. She did not, when spring came in earnest, turn her winnings into a show. She used the settlement as she had planned to from the first afternoon she had understood how large it would be to heal the ground. She replaced the cracked panes of the greenhouse. She rebuilt the sagging corner of the barn where the roof had leaked for 3 winters. She widened the seed gardens Genevieve had started as a young mother and Prudence had tended in her old age. She put a new hard cap on the well. She paid off the seasonal operating note in full and closed the account. She paid Bristol's remaining tuition through graduation into an escrow at the university's bursar's office so that no future storm would be able to reach it. Then she stopped spending money on herself entirely and went back to work. Bristol came home for the summer in early June. She walked out along the fence line with her mother in the first still evening of her visit past the corner where the old cedar post still leaned silver into the last of the sun, and she told Delphine without any preamble that she had changed her major. She had spent the previous semester, she said, sitting in on land use classes at the university's School of Law with the informal permission of one of the professors, and she had decided that when she finished her undergraduate work the following spring, She was going to apply to law school. She wanted to do agricultural title work. She wanted to learn what Winifred Ashby knew. She wanted to be in her own generation what her mother had needed the year before and had almost not found in time. Delphine did not for a moment answer. She looked out across the northern strip toward the corridor of Larkspur Road, restored now to its original packed dirt and edged with the first pale green of new lavender coming up along the ditch. And she thought of Marlowe writing to a daughter she had never lived to meet in the winter of 1912, and of Prudence tapping the pantry board with a worn brown boot, and of Genevieve walking a small girl along a fence line and pointing out the old cedar posts. She thought of the sentence in Marlowe's letter about learning to look down before you look up. She thought of the fund at Winifred's office. She thought of the way Bristol had stood in the mudroom the previous fall with a manila envelope in her hands and said, "All right, Mama," in a voice that had not even once cracked. Then Delphine put her arm around her daughter's shoulders and drew her close and said only, "Well then, we had better make sure Winifred is still practicing when you get out." Bristol laughed. It was a small laugh, but it went on longer than either of them had expected, and neither one made any effort to cut it short. The reporter from Kansas City came back at the end of June. She had by then written her original piece and a follow-up in a longer feature that had been picked up by a national wire. And she had one last question she wanted to ask, which was how it felt to have beaten a $900 million project. Delphine took her out to the porch and gave her a cup of coffee and considered the question for a long time before she answered it. "I did not beat the future," Delphine told her at last, watching a delivery truck rock down the packed dirt of the reopened road with a fresh order of heirloom seed bound for a market in St. Louis. "I only reminded them that you don't get to build it by burying other people." The reporter wrote that sentence down. She underlined it in her notebook. She did not later use it as her lad because she felt it belonged at the end of her piece and not the beginning. And Delphine, when she read the story a week later, thought the young woman had guessed exactly right. The last thing Delphine did that summer before the lavender came into its second flush of bloom was to take the 1912 deed down to a small framer's shop in Elkin Ford, whose window Winifred had pointed out to her one Tuesday afternoon. And she paid the older man behind the counter to place the brittle paper between two panes of museum-grade glass in a plain oak frame. He handled it with the same careful attention Winifred had used with the cotton gloves, and he did not, unlike almost every other stranger she had spoken to in the past 9 months, ask her what the paper was. When she brought the framed deed home, she did not hang it in the parlor where visitors might have seen it. She hung it in the kitchen above the low bulb over the sink, where a woman standing at the drainboard rinsing a coffee cup could look up and read the reversion clause without moving her feet. Bristol asked her on the second night after the frame had gone up why she had chosen the kitchen. Delphine stood a while with her hands in the sink water and thought about it before she answered, because Bristol was studying to become a lawyer now, and it seemed to Delphine that the girl deserved a considered reply. "Because the kitchen," Delphine told her at last, "is where the tapping was." That was all she said. Bristol looked at the frame and at the tint type of Marlowe on the opposite wall and at the pantry door beyond it, and she nodded once slowly in a way that Delphine understood as the tapping being passed forward. Marguerite Vandermeer disappeared quietly from the trade press in the months that followed. She surfaced briefly the following winter as a private consultant to a mid-sized firm in Denver without a public office and without a title on any letterhead. And Delphine, if she thought of her at all, thought of her only in the way one thinks of a passing weather front, as a thing that had once altered the shape of an afternoon and had since moved on. Sterling Beaumont III kept the Redstone Inland Port alive. He did it as he had told Delphine at her kitchen table he would by redrawing the design by building an access road around the Hollister ground that did not so much as touch her fence line, by paying the lease on the northern strip in full and on time each quarter. The port opened 18 months later than originally planned in a modest ribbon cutting to which Delphine was invited, in which she declined. It hired local people. It brought a rail spur. It widened a road that had needed widening for 30 years. The future got built, after all. It simply had to be built honestly in the end, which was all Delphine had ever asked of it. On a warm evening late in the summer of Bristol's senior year, Delphine walked the fence line one more time in the last honest light. The lavender was in its second bloom of the season purple to the tree line, and the reopened road ran packed and clean along the base of the corridor, with a small wooden sign at the mouth of the drive that she had lettered herself over the winter and hung on a length of chain from a cedar post. Hollister Farm, established 1912. The old placard with the corporation's clean, confident lettering had been taken down long ago and hauled away, and no marker of Vandermeer Meridian remained anywhere on her ground. She stopped at the corner where the old cedar posts leaned silver into the sun. She laid her hand on the top of the nearest one, the way she had laid it there on a wet October afternoon a lifetime ago, and she looked out across the northern strip toward the low profile of the port. In the far distance, its warehouse roofs catching the light, its truck route running exactly where Sterling Beaumont III had promised her it would well clear of her fence. She stood a long moment. She thought of the letter of surrender she had cut into ribbons at her kitchen table in the middle of the night. She thought of the fire in the Westfield. She thought of Bristol's face in the mudroom the following morning. She thought of the 3 lines from the hotel stationery and of Marguerite Vandermeer across a parking lot in sodium light saying, "You are enjoying this." She thought of what she had said in return. She was not standing at the corner of her own fence enjoying it now. She had never enjoyed it. She was, if she had to name what she felt, only clear. She had been raised by women who had understood that the ground you stand on is a chain you are briefly permitted to hold, and she had done in her generation what those women had done in theirs. She had kept the ground. She had passed the tap forward. She had proven once again in her own small, stubborn Missouri corner of the country the truth Marlowe Threadgill Hollister had set into the deed in the winter of 1912. That the rich can buy land, that they are too lazy in the end to read what lies beneath it. She turned back toward the house. The kitchen window burned yellow in the deepening blue of the yard, small and steady, the same window Reed Kettleman had once glanced at from the shoulder of Larkspur Road before dawn, and dismissed as belonging to a woman he could bury as easily as a road. Delphine walked toward that light with her hands loose at her sides. Somewhere inside Bristol was frying onions for the supper the two of them would eat together at the checked oilcloth beneath the framed deed and the tint type of Marlowe. Somewhere farther out along the reopened corridor of Larkspur Road, a late delivery truck was rolling in with an order for the fall. Somewhere far off to the north along the fresh access road that Sterling Beaumont III had built around her ground, an 18-wheeler was pulling into the port with its running lights on, hauling freight to a future that had in the end been built without burying anyone. They had buried the road so that she would have nowhere to go. They had believed in their 1,000-line internal memos and their Sunday afternoon emails and their charcoal wool coats that a poor woman alone would run out of options and out of hope before their trucks ran out of dirt. But that same buried road in the end had led their whole corporation step by step straight to the door of a state administrative chamber in Jefferson City on a Monday morning in November. And it was the road in the end that had nowhere left to hide. The woman had been standing on her own ground the whole time. Delphine climbed the porch steps. She wiped her boots on the mat. She opened the mudroom door and let the warm smell of onions and coffee come out to meet her in the yard. And she stepped inside her own kitchen at the end of the long day under the framed deed of a woman who had died before her mother had been born. And she closed the door behind her softly, the way one closes a door on a house that has at last been made whole.